Israeli population is not really pushing for the Netanyahu policies. They are really against the Netanyahu policies. And he's really Zionist, and his policies are to invade part of North Africa in order to expand. So they're really on an expansion process. And they're not telling you that. You know, Israeli occupies, you know, the Golan Heights from 1968. And you know, Syria is trying to regain access to the Golan Heights, and then they refuse to allow Syria back into its own territory. And if you really watch, and I've been, you know, watching a lot of videos, a lot of documentaries, and I read a lot on Israel. The Israeli people are innocent. The Jewish population in Israel, the majority of them, almost every week they have a protest against Netanyahu. They're trying to get him out because he's not supporting their policies. They're not working on solving the two-state issue. One, second, the Palestinian people, they have no weapons. They are really a powerless population that Netanyahu, I won't say Israel because I don't like to use that general term, because when we say Israel, we kind of condemning an entire population, where in fact, that entire population has nothing to do with what Netanyahu is pushing and his president. And it's the same thing, some of the policies that US is pushing throughout the rest of the world. Are we Americans supporting those policies? We have nothing to do with those policies. But sometimes people have to find a way to differentiate, to say, well, you know, I don't have any problems with Americans. However, I have problems with the way the US government is pushing certain foreign policies in other countries that are destroying their political system and their economic structure. So if you keep on using or pushing for those foreign policies that are destroying the livelihoods of people because you want to expand, there's one way of expanding where you include the entire population in the economic structure. But when you remove the economic structure from the people, which they have been doing for the past 45 years, you know, there's an article, there's actually a report, you know, exporting poverty. US is exporting poverty throughout the rest of the world. You know, they've attacked, you know, agriculture sector in many countries, over 100 countries. You know, they've attacked political system. As a matter of fact, there's a report from a book from a guy named Stephen something, you know, where US has literally dismantled and destroyed 100 did 100 coup to 100 countries. So we have to always look at the policies that governments are pushing for and not the entire population.
You had your hand up?
A long time.
Okay, so you and then Farid, then?
I'm going to say.
Come in when you want to.
Okay. So I'm going to critique what you said, because there's nowhere, well, I'll just say it this way. Netanyahu, yes, he is the president.
He's the prime minister.
The prime minister. And yes, it's not like the United States where we have Trump and we have a lot of criticism about Trump, because these really people, I mean, when you're 18, you go into the IDF, period. You are there to kill. To monitor, you got your time to speak, I get my time to speak. No, let me finish.
Right.
And every Israeli citizen, they have protests. It isn't a majority of Israelis that are protesting the government. It's a few, very, very few. You read and I read and a lot of us read, very few. And it's becoming more and more criminalized to protest.
If they go to jail.
It's becoming a criminal act. So we talk about freedom. So Israel is for Israel. Israel is a Zionist country. And when you criticize Israel, because Israel equals Jew, means you're being anti-Semitic. It shuts people up because you think that you're an anti-Semite. But they are on an expedition of expansion, and they won't be happy until every Palestinian is dead. That is what it is.
Yes.
That's it. They want to get, they don't want to have a Palestinian conflict. They want to get rid of them by any means. They don't want them to be alive. They want to erase their history because as they settle, they destroy the history of what existed there. So it's called annihilation. It's genocide. And every Israeli believes that. They do think, oh yes, we don't want to have conflict. We want peace. We want a two-state solution. Yeah, the second state to be out in the moon. It just is like, we don't want to deal with them. I get you so angry when you say that, as if you really know the
what I'm
situation.
saying.
Israelis do not
know what I'm saying.
No, like,
You're not
no.
criticizing what I'm saying.
Well, then I'm saying something different than what you said.
All the Israelis are not innocent, okay? Okay, they killed my family. All the Israelis are 3 years in the army, 2 years, not gonna interrupt me. 2 years with the woman, they're very aggressive behavior. You did not see last week 30,000 people in Tel Aviv were holding banners, huge banners, kill all the Arabs. Did you see that? When you're telling me all the Israelis are innocent, are you out of your mind? You're out of your mind. You're really out of your mind. You're out of your mind. You come and tell me and tell my family all the Israelis are innocent. Do not talk when I talk.
Yeah, let's
All the Israelis are not innocent. They have blood on their hands. They have blood on their hands.
There's a lot of factors that are missing. One, please look into deadly exchanges where there's an entire industry of police departments, ICE, all these agencies going over there to learn how to beat up black people from Palestine and come back here and kill black people.
That's right.
So there is a whole entire industry of murdering black and brown people, torturing and raping and killing Palestinian folks, including black Palestinian women. So another factor is this. There is a industry called Beit Jerusalem, right? Which is the most racist, and they make money off of this. They say that it is the worst racist football league in Jerusalem. And you know how powerful that football club is? They make and break prime ministers. If a person who wants to be prime minister, go get supported by this football club. If this football club don't like them, they're no longer prime minister. Every single prime minister was supported that football club. Israel is a racist, white supremacist, colonial, genocidal country.
Yes.
And what's unfortunate is there were more Holocaust survivors that did not want to be there, who did not support Israeli apartheid. And their legacy was tarnished. My friend Michael Rice was a Holocaust survivor, the only kid that survived a school boarding massacre in Hungary. And you know what the youth did today, the pro-Zionist youth today? They called him anti-Semite. He's a Holocaust survivor.
Jew-hating Jew.
Holocaust survivor in Hungary. And he said, I'm going to wipe my ass with that statement. But what's interesting is, anti-Semitism exists in Europe.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, there are not a lot of Jews
Right?
in Hungary, are there?
Right? No, right? Yes. What's unfortunate is that other Semites like Palestinians, were slaughtered and massacred because Europe couldn't address their bullshit.
Yeah.
Palestinians suffered due to white supremacy and anti-Semitism
Right.
because they couldn't address it. And they kicked people out instead of saying, we're sorry we fucked up. Now we're going to go beat up the other people that...
And they still have a problem addressing it.
No, but it's like nobody's here.
Just,
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
not acknowledging that people live there already.
Hello, everyone. Listen. Jackie gave a good historical.
Excellent.
I mean, absolutely excellent. What you kind of didn't mention was that Richard, the fucking Lionhearted, went into the Holy Land during the First Crusade. They captured 3,000 Palestinians, and what the rules of war at the time were, once there was peace, they were supposed to let them go. But Richard, the fucking Lionhearted, killed 3,000.
Well, I mentioned that they were put into the synagogue.
They were, yeah, and they were murdered. The thing is about, I'm in the middle of the fence because it's a very complicated situation. On one hand, Israel's got to defend itself. It's surrounded by, nations that want it totally out, okay? On the other hand, Israel is destroying Palestine. So what is the solution? But the one thing that I really hate, okay, is when Jews are considered Zionists. When I do a lot of business in India, okay? And around 1947, 1948, the British, they partitioned India into Hindustan, which is now India, and Pakistan, okay? They did the same thing that they did in Israel like a year later. And why they did that, they had to divest their colonies because Germany was after them. They didn't have enough money, they didn't have enough resources to continue keeping the colonies, okay? So the point is that the situation between Palestine and Israel, whatever it is, it's global. This is not just Palestine and Israel. This has to do with us. This has to do with India. It's got to do with the entire, what they call the Middle East, which is North Africa.
That's right.
It's got to do with all of us. So what I'm saying is, if you don't get involved, Trump has got no right to go in to Israel and say, this is your,
Jerusalem.
he had no right to do that. Why could he do that? The thing is that Trump is in India doing the same fucking thing.
Amen.
He's in India, where I do my charity, destroying the fucking country, destroying the economy, and Modi, who is now the Prime Minister of India, is just going along with it. Trump has got hotels galore all over India. Okay?
Yeah, you have your
That's it.
hand up. Yeah, I want to hear.
All fascists use security as a reason to kill another group. We do it, and Israel does it. If you read the history, going back to the Balfour Declaration at that time, it's consistent, going back the turn of this going into the end of the 1800s. It's consistent. You know exactly what the idea is and how it became turned from religious to political. Now, it was if you really read, if you're able to read the Ben-Gurion diaries, you see exactly how he changed the narrative, and he made security the issue. They made themselves insecure by committing genocide, going around to villages and massacring villages. They wanted to install fear.
One of the initial leaders and founders of Al-Awda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, which was and is to some extent an international organization that focuses specifically and highlights, underscores, and insists on the inclusion and advancement of the right for Palestinians to return to Palestine and on the primacy of Palestinian refugees in any and all movements related to and that talk about Palestine. So, and I'm still with Al-Awda and with quite a number of organizations and have founded several which are working now, which we hope will be useful. What I'm gonna do is, I think we've got enough history and outline and framing of, what's happened since 48, before 48, and in Gaza. And, as a practitioner, I'm gonna focus on the more practical, useful kind of what tools. I'm gonna do my best to offer some tools, some framing, and then I'm gonna insist, as I've insisted for us, for our own people, first for myself, for my family and for my peers, the Palestinians amongst us who are constantly trying to recover from our own trauma as a result of simply being Palestinian, let alone having lived and existed under extreme amounts of physical and psychological violence, that as I ask this of us, who are suffering, I ask this of you, who are our allies and who will benefit from our victory, that we all collectively end our reflexive response to these patterns of behavior that have not ended in 70 years, number one, and number two, that we also end our intellectual and our political and our strategic, forgive me for this term, laziness. What's needed in this world, and I don't mean just for Palestine, and I will tie how the conditions for Palestinians and Palestinian refugees in particular are directly tied to any prospect of global peace and development, right? So we do this not just specifically for Palestine, but it is critical if we look at macro level detailed economic and political and social and development relationships. It is important that when we address Palestine, we understand that it's central to this, and number two, that we do so actively with creativity and by putting in real intellectual, political, and strategic labor. I'm not going to get too heavy into the tools that you need. The law is on our side. Is there anybody that would like a 1 or 2 minute cursory overview of what laws or precedents you could refer to talk about it? Okay, beautiful. Let me just say, let's take it down to the basics. As Jihad and Samia said earlier, one of the biggest issues that Palestinians face is the obfuscation of these really basic, simple issues that people claim are complex when they are not. At the heart of the Palestinian right to return, or the right to return for anybody, is simply this. You have the right to wake up in the morning, to leave your house, to come to the Left Forum, and you have the right to go back, right? Every day you have the right to get up in the morning, to go to work, and to go back to your house. Do you not? Does anybody think that they do not have the right to do this? Raise your hands. Okay, so we all have the right to do this. There's an objector there, but well, you can address that in Q&A. So simple, you would assume it's this right. Without this right, you have apocalyptic chaos, right? And so all precedents, all principles of international relations predating the state system have essentially largely recognized this right. Then we come to 1948, the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And the UN Declaration on Human Rights very specifically says that anybody who leaves his home has the right, that everybody has the right to leave and re-enter their country. Country. Didn't say state, it said country. One day later, Resolution 194, specifically relating to Palestinians, the first agenda item on the newly formed UN, Resolution 194, said that all Palestinians wishing to return to live at peace with their neighbors must be allowed to do so at the earliest practicable date. Resolution 194 went further to say that they must be readmitted and they must be protected from those seeking to breach the peace. And it also says that Palestinians have the right to return, restitution, and, not or, and reparations, right? It's a lot more than anything anybody's ever talked about in the media when it comes to Palestinians generally, but certainly when it's come to Palestinian refugees. Now, according to the Nuremberg trials, the International Military Tribunal, it is a war crime to engage in forced population transfers. War crime. It is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions to preclude refugees trying to re-enter their home from doing so with violence. So you're looking at war crimes that have been ongoing for 70 years, and we're watching them on an escalated Nuremberg trial level happening now in Gaza. There are also nationality and state succession laws, and that'll be the last of it. Nationality laws say that any sovereign can grant anybody else nationality. Fine, granted. This is how Israel overcame the fact that, respectfully, a Jewish person in this room can go and live in my home without having to even present a piece of paper saying that they have any connection to my house at Mifrak Beta in Hawara. They can go and they can live there, right? So that's 1952 Israeli nationality laws. But these nationality laws are in violation, in contravention of all international laws, including the Convention Against Discrimination, which says that you can't grant nationality that has a discriminatory purpose, right? And it's also part of population transfer. You also can't preclude people who have been habitual residents of a territory, even in the case of state succession. So even let's say, the British Mandate of Palestine was legally, and it was not, even by its own terms, it was not legally succeeded by the entity or state of Israel. Even if Israel did come into existence, Israel has the obligation to provide nationality for all habitual residents of the territory, even if they were absent at the point of succession. And they've they've denied this. Instead, what they've done is they've not only precluded them war crimes, grave breaches of Geneva Convention, but they've also increased the very actors who engage in the breach of peace that prevents their re-entrance, to wit, armed settlers, mobilized agents of the colonizing state, which serves the purpose of ethnic cleansing. These are your tools. There is no shortage of common sense, principle, and legal precedent to use in articulating the right for Palestinians to return. In fact, in modern day conflict, no conflict is resolved without first addressing the issue of the repatriation of the refugees. And that's because it's a duty owed to other states. It's not just a matter of a duty owed to the refugee population, it's a duty owed to other states. If you want to be a decent, moral, useful, non-burden on the rest of the world, as Israel is in many ways, then it is your obligation not to burden people and the region and the world with this boiling cauldron of political grievances called refugees, which are straddling all of these countries in the Middle East, and poof, there you have. The region is constantly in turmoil. It's not constantly in turmoil. There is a cause and an inception for that turmoil that spreads everywhere. And we'll go into more detail how that works. So there's no shortage of that. Briefly, I want to talk about a little bit about the UN. And the only reason I care to talk about it is because this is a tool and a strategy. The UN Commission for the Conciliation of Palestine was established in 1948. And it was supposed to serve the Palestinian refugees and resolve the issue of the Palestinian refugees. And there were three countries leading this: Turkey, the US, and France. What they managed to do, I think, by 1949 or 1951, was they managed to release approximately $40,000. Because we talk about the exile, we don't talk about the theft that the Israelis and the Zionists engaged in, right? The factories and the farms and the actual gold and money that they stood. I mean, they would put men, I don't know, I'm sorry if Samuel talked about this, they would put town elders and literally clean out their pockets as they were sending them to be refugees. I mean, very disgusting behavior. This is aside from the labor camps, right? So they managed to get about $40,000 belonging to Palestinian refugees released to them, and they managed to identify who the Palestinian refugees are. By 1952, the US insisted that the issue of Palestinian refugees was a state issue. An issue for the very state that exists specifically by transferring that population and identifies itself only in opposition to that population. That's its identity, right? By 2000, the US refused to allow the issue of refugees to be addressed by the UNCCP, which continues to operate, and all it does is have one paragraph. So just keeping in mind the UNCCP exists, what and how cannot be used, right? Then you have UNRWA, and UNRWA has been a great service. 1948, it was supposed to have a temporary mandate until the repatriation of Palestinian refugees. 1948, 70 years of a temporary mandate. And it was supposed to provide, you know, as Jihad said here, give them some food, right? Give them, fix their tents, make them, you know, small little prisons that they can, you know, populate into. Kind of like encampments, because the camps are basically these kind of mini Gazas, is really what you have in these refugee camps. And they were supposed to employ Palestinians in public works. And that would have been a noble thing to do, because public works really has an eye towards repatriation and reintegration. Well, that didn't last very long at all. They were no longer employing Palestinians to help keep them a skilled population that can more easily reintegrate into Palestine. They were made and forced into a full charity situation. And UNRWA is great, and we need UNRWA. And one of the most important things about UNRWA is a living record of Zionist and Israeli crimes. And that's how I think we should begin looking at UNRWA. I'm offering all of this so that people's, you know, creative juices are churning, right? UNRWA should be looked at as a living record of Zionist and Israeli crimes. But UNRWA has served, unfortunately, a difficult purpose. I'm running out of time already, but I'm gonna try to fly through this. UNRWA has also served to be a buffer and to protect Israel from its crimes, which is the ongoing exile and refusal to allow Palestinian refugees to enter. And it also gives US and UN kind of protection, acts as a buffer. It's a shock absorber, right? When you have a refugee crisis, the whole world feels it. Well, UNRWA has been incubating Palestinian refugees physically, politically, economically, and then separating them from the Palestinian national body, right? The other obstacle to Palestinian return that we have, we saw the UN. The UN is fully empowered to enforce, or to act with force to protect the peace. The UN is fully empowered to do that. You see the UN is rendered impotent by the US, right? Veto power, UN Security Council by the US veto power. UN actors are actively, directly tied to Israeli interests. Okay, that's another obstacle, right? So it's not self-executing. International law is not self-executing, and those who are capable of executing it are not interested in doing so, and that also now includes the Arab countries, right, or the Muslim countries in the region. Then, of course, you have Israeli violence. And then lastly, you have Oslo, right? Oslo has been a tremendous obstacle to Palestinian return, and not just because of what's happening in Ramallah, but because of what's happening globally. The NGOization of the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian movement, even here in the United States. What we saw in Oslo was a terrible blow to the right of Palestinians to return. What Oslo did is what no other precedent and no other movement ever did. It tied the right to return, the implementation of return, to a final status agreement, which has never been done. And it is directly contradictory to the terms of Resolution 194. So when Oslo says, and when the PA says, as expressed by Resolution 194, this is intentional footnote rhetoric. It's meant to keep it at the very bottom, because Israel's position and the US position is that there is no solution that includes the refugee. This is it. That's why Trump's deal, of the New Century deal, whatever he's calling it, provides a humanitarian solution to the refugees. That's not return. That's not political resolution. So Oslo first tied it, right, to this, which meant that it's postponed. So you Palestinian refugees, 2/3 of the Palestinian population living outside of Palestine, your grievances don't exist until God knows when, right? Number one. Number two, it divided physically and politically the Palestinian refugees from the Palestinians in the West Bank, from the Palestinians globally, by posing the Palestinian Authority as the power with which it would deal. And this also then precluded and prevented Palestinians, the majority of whom, again, live outside of Palestine, from engaging in the political processes that speak in their names, the right to return specifically. The refugees, who are the ultimate owners of these rights, weren't able to engage in those. And lastly, it made the PA engaged in busy work that focused not on building a state itself, right? Not on a state, but on state building, right? Not on like the state of affairs, but on building a state, right? And it turned everything, all of these state building projects, into kind of warehouses where various aspects of Palestinian grievances were warehoused and then attended to by NGOs, and money was pumped into the West Bank, specifically into Ramallah, to do this, and money was pumped into NGOs globally to address this. So despite the fact, and how does this affect us here? Al-Awda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, has been in existence since 2000. I'm sorry, just here, it's disruptive. Thank you. So since 2000, Al-Awda has been saying Palestine right to return is critical for bringing peace to the region and peace in Palestine, even for the Zionists and the Israelis that live there. Let's talk about the right to return. Let's talk about refugees. And you know what the allied organizations, the NGOs, who claim to be our friends and allies of the Palestinian movement at the time were doing when we were doing it, and we still feel the impact of this, they were dedicating websites to making fun of how silly our demand for return was. These were like notable, people who are notable in the movement now were notable in the movement then, not Palestinian, of course, and allies who actually dedicated websites to making fun of and to marginalizing us for talking about the right to return. And this continued for years. Countless organizations marginalized and demonized Al-Auda specifically because our points of unity focused on the return. This most basic, simple right, which had we had a movement of allies that stood with us and said the same thing, I guarantee you, we wouldn't have had to have our people dying. Because yes, what they did gave us more progress in 40 days than we have in 40 years because of all of this obfuscation by NGOs and by money and by allies who were really, had Zionist interests or at least were depending on Zionist money. Okay, so these were the obstacles. I want to talk about why return. I'm going to try to do that as briefly as possible. And I give why return because I know everybody knows, but I want you to know a little more because I want you to use it. And then I'm going to offer a few proposals. Why return? Number one, macro level. Macro level. Israel is the most militarized society on earth. The reason that it's militarized is because it defines itself as having to exclude, in its practice, it has to exclude Palestinians. The only way that it can continue to exclude Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims specifically in an Arab-Muslim region is to be militarized. In order to have the military and to justify its militarization, it has to export weapons. In order to export weapons, it has to have markets. To have markets, it often needs to create markets to make itself relevant. Therefore, you see Israel in Sudan, you see Israel in El Salvador, you see Israel in Nicaragua, you see Israel throughout the world fomenting, building markets for its weaponry. And now it's trying to increase the African Union to new levels, new heights. So it's constantly involved in the industry of fomenting war, producing more arms, comes back in, more money to get newer technology, to keep more Palestinians out and to kill more Palestinians better and more slowly and to get away with it. So Palestinian return is the most peaceful, easy, 20 minutes, Jihad said, 20-minute walk to dismantle a critical cog in the global war industry and the global militarization project. That's it, right? If Palestinians are allowed to return to their homes, then the reason that Israel is a militarized society no longer exists, because Palestinians have reached their ultimate demand. Let us go home. This is it. That's all we ask. Let us stay home. Let us go home. Practically speaking, not even 10% of the Israeli population living in Palestinian homes would have to move, right? Now, I say move. This brings me to another reason why return and why we have to talk about it. When you say the right to return, you are finally articulating in real terms the interests, even the conflicting interests that are involved when you talk about Palestine and Israel. How so? Now, the Zionist mythology and Hasbara and criminalization focuses on Palestinians want to throw the Jews into the sea, right? First of all, as though Palestinian Jews were not part of the population living there with us, our people, many of whom converted, by the way, to Islam after Israel was formed, right? Never mind that, but Palestinians want to throw the Jews into the sea. The irony is it's the Palestinians that are being thrown into refugee camps, but Palestinians want to throw the Jews into the sea. When you talk about right to return, that makes you talk about this, the implementation of return, which means that we have to talk about what do Palestinians really want. They want to go back to their homes, right? They don't want to throw anybody into the sea. They want to go back to their homes. How do they want to do that? Let's look at the Algerian model. The Algerian model for the decolonization of Algeria talked about the rights of secondary occupants, right? The Algerian liberation movement specifically outlined how they would integrate or reintegrate and do all of this. And this is, easily Googleable for Guatemala, for Bosnia, for Rwanda, for all of these other places. What happens to secondary occupants, the Israelis, right? Well, in the Algerian model, for example, or we could talk about another model, in the Algerian model, the secondary occupants were given a 6-month period to vacate the house. If they didn't vacate the house, then they would have to face some sort of tribunal. The Algerians were given restitution. They were allowed to access whatever, and if they didn't want to necessarily go back to the original home, they were given a home of equal or greater value along with all the land. So full restitution. So now you could talk about the Israelis as secondary occupants, and you can talk about Palestinians as rightful owners, and you also dismantle the Hasbara line of they want to throw the Jews into the sea. right? So it's very important to begin articulating the details of return. Not just Palestinians want to return, but hey, cool, let them live there. They're clearly, I used to say all the time, we shouldn't ask Palestinians to be so peaceful so as to commit a mass suicide. And Palestinians in Gaza proved to be far better than anything I could be, clearly, because what they said is if it takes our murder for us and all of you to eventually go home, then, we're going to risk that. I mean, that's risking life for, risking life for love, really. That's what that is, right? So that's the second reason or ground that I think we should talk about return. Which brings us to what does global or even regional development look like? Right now, Israeli development is based on militarization for exclusion, technology for exclusion, technology for colonization. You have return and you have development for inclusion based on human rights, based on all of these noble, lofty goals from which we all directly benefit, as we saw. What do we do? Most of my proposals, I've been largely involved in focusing on, Palestine, intern to Palestine. We're at a critical point in the Palestinian movement, and then 2 minutes, I'm done, Nardine. We see the impotence of the UN. That doesn't mean that there aren't avenues that we have to start researching to use an international forum inside the UN. This needs to be studied, number one. The propaganda campaigns that Jihad talked about. I see you shaking your head. It's overwhelming. But yes, but you know why? Because we haven't sat down and prepared a proper colloquium. We need to sit down, spend 2-3 days, right, collectively by ourselves, thinking about how we prepare and how we advance our narrative in a way that can't be disturbed by Zionist propaganda, right? So we need to do this. This is part of ending our intellectual laziness. This needs to be done. And then this needs to be carried into the UN. The UN has open conferences. At these open conferences are states. States are sitting there listening to interventions by people sitting on the outside. This affects them. People need to attend, and when they're ready with their narrative and their colloquium, which must focus on return, apartheid, and colonization, not just any old colonization, because Zionist colonization is a whole other breed, colonization for the purpose of ethnic cleansing, right? These are what need to be carried out and then turned into sentences that can transcend all Zionist Hezbollah. This has to be a project. This has to be an ongoing project. Solidarity, respectfully to all our allies. First of all, we are owed an apology from all of the groups who have marginalized and demonized us for decades because we asked to return, right? This has materially impacted how we have been treated in mainstream society, but also how we have been treated by this government, right? This marginalization has led to the criminalization of many of us. It has been a direct danger, number one. Number two, allies, we ask that you please center and tie your actions in practical ways and not rhetoric ways specifically to the demand for return. So sanctions until return, not sanctions until ending the occupation. The occupation is 1967. Palestinian refugees come from 1967, 1948, and 1947 Palestine. So sanctions until return. And the order in which we phrase things is very important, right? It impacts the ear and it impacts the psychology, right? What is said first is always the most important. So that primacy has to be articulated in writing and in speech. I'm going to stop here, and I'm probably missing things. I know we're both fasting and quite tired at this point. I just want to say lastly, I hope that at least, not just for the sake of the Palestinians, but for our own sake, we understand how important it is to really become just quite a bit more active. And I say for myself, it's been a rough, I'm sorry, I'm just tired. I get emotional when I'm tired. It's been a rough go. It's been a particularly rough period with the Great Return March. The murder of Razan in Najjar was particularly painful for many of us. But what our people in Gaza have given us, and they did this for themselves and for their children, but they've done this for us, is a prime opportunity. And it is criminal waste on our part. It is reckless and negligent for ourselves and for Palestinians to fail to properly harness this momentum that they gave us. This was not the first time that Palestinian refugees raced to their homes and were killed. In 2008, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria raced to their homes and were killed. Let this be the last time our people have to do it. We are in a position of privilege. We are in a position that has proximity to power. How do we use it? And I thank you very much.
We have about 20 minutes for a Q&A, so I'm gonna take 3 at a time and contextualize it. I saw your hand go up first.
Well, I think that the moral and the legal case for Palestinian return and self-determination couldn't be any more clear. And I think the majority of not just the peoples of the world, but the governments of the world support it. I just wish I felt more hopeful that there was a political mechanism to actually defend it. And I don't think the UN is that because of the United States law.
Yes.
The United States has never been a fair broker. It never will be. It certainly won't be with Trump. The EU is sort of out of the picture. The triumvirate, I don't know what they ever even did except make some noises. The Palestinians have done everything from armed struggle to mass nonviolent resistance. They're up against the 5th most powerful military state in the world with a nuclear arsenal. It's hard to feel optimistic that there's an effective strategy forward.
I'll answer.
I think that's what we need more than anything, is just
So an
some
effective
feeling of
strategy
hope.
forward is your question.
Hopefulness.
Got it. Thank you. I saw your hand up also, yeah.
I'm a lawyer in the United States and in France. I'm also proud to be a walk the talk activist in the West Bank. I just want to add a legal thing. Another right that prisoners have, I'm also a criminal lawyer as well as immigration, etc., is the right for visits. A lot of the activists that I've invited to come to the West Bank, protest the occupation, really get there, face the tear gas, and whatever it takes. Can't get through because they unfortunately tell them the truth at Ben Gurion that they're going to the West Bank. And so they don't, I mean, they're prisoners in the West Bank and of course in Gaza. They don't allow them through because they say they're going to the West Bank. So there's also a violation of prisoners' rights for visits. It's just another legal thing.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I saw your hand. And please, sorry, not before you, but to address it to everyone, please keep it to questions for now. We can talk after, but just so we utilize this time to answer your questions.
I'm gonna ask a
Yeah.
question. Now, something that you didn't mention is that we here in the United States are living in an occupied country, okay? We took this from the Native Americans. It's pretty much like Palestine. A couple years ago, and I will ask the question, okay? The Dakota Pipeline took over the ancestral land in North Dakota of the Native Americans. So how do you equate that we are sitting here living in occupied country with what's happening in Palestine?
Also, since there were 2 more kind of comments, I'm gonna take 2 more questions and then break it up between the panelists like that.
Maybe just take it all.
Okay, and I'll just take everything, yeah. So I think I saw your hand first in the back. No? Sorry.
Quick, to a direct question.
Yeah.
There have been many larger things here. What I hear is that a traditional thing that I hear coming from families where siblings are against each other about who has rights to their family territory. And I don't hear that there may be a third view that's not the way it's seen. And what I hear is it's put into a time framework that's a very limited one. And there are longer things that go on. My time, an important time for me in Palestine, starts in 1980. It was the first time from a psychological point of view, when I was a psychiatrist, that we defined trauma as the source of mental distress and changes in how we think. And what I hear here is the vast trauma and the correct trauma and what it has done to a set of people. But we can see those in certain kinds of terms that we see in other groups that run through, the kinds of responses that come there. And the old solutions about how to deal with that have not worked in the past. They've only led to further conflict. And unless we use new solutions and a different way of approaching this than setting up the conflict between the people who are coming out of trauma, we will not have a solution. So we need to think a new way of doing it, not what was done in the past, because we now have a different understanding of why people get to these points and do these things that is different than
Yeah.
it ever been.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so is that in any of the solutions that we
Yes, thank you. What's it called? You have, I think I saw your hand first, actually, yeah.
Quick question,
Yeah.
is sitting in Jerry Nadler's congressional district, what's the best way to at least get Jerry Nadler to change?
Jerry, they're sitting, Jerry, I'll tell you in a second. What's your question?
It's about how to engage Congress.
I'm pretty despairing, as is your presentation, of the role of the United Nations, but there are cracks.
Exactly.
And specifically, again, even though the Human Rights Commission has had horrible failures, there was a resolution passed by a group, people of African descent, headed by a sister who you know, Samia, France Fanon's daughter, in Paris, the Fanon Foundation. She led this task force, and the task force concluded that African Americans in particular suffered from trauma, suffered from unbelievable levels of every level of oppression, and were entitled to reparations. Now, unfortunately, that has not been widely disseminated. I organized a small event, but it was really small compared to what's needed. So there are opportunities, and then the question is, how do we get the word out? But I want to mention in all this that the UN is not totally hopeless. And the potential for it is huge, and I strongly urge you to be in touch with the Fanon Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate that. Last question over here before we have 15 minutes.
It's about the international courts.
Yeah.
And what they may or may not be able to do.
Okay, so the relevant, like, how,
Yeah.
relevancy of international courts. Okay, so, do you want to do like?
Yeah, let me I'll do technical and do really quick. In terms of international courts, criminal prosecution, largely, and, you know, people are working on exceptions, are largely, only states have standing. And this is where this ties into what you were saying and kind of gives more hope, I think, for you, is that, you know, because a lot of the duties are owed, that Israel owes, aren't just owed to the Palestinians, but owed to third states, right? And because Israel is engaging in unequivocal war crimes, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches by even like the strictest definition of these things, also third states have an obligation not to engage in certain practices that would empower or facilitate or support Israel to continue these war crimes. So there are avenues where we can begin really thinking about states or quasi-state institutions that we in this room could begin to lobby in terms of at least, you know, beating the drums or trying to get there. The reason that the PA doesn't do it is because the U.S. made it a condition of their embassy not to go to the ICC, to the international ICC, right? I know, I'm ICC or ICJ in my head. So going back to the issue of the UN, no doubt, there are. But that doesn't mean that the UN isn't a place. I mean, you have to, if you've ever spent time at the UN, the narrative is such a dead dinosaur of a narrative around Palestine. It's unimaginable. And if you talk to states like Bolivia, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, like other states, South Africa, you know, one thing that we did, actually, I think this should give people hope. There was going to be an Israel to Africa summit that was being held in Togo, right? And Israel was going to go there, and it was its first step to joining the African Union, the irony of this, right? And so what we did is we had a meeting. One of our elders said, listen, this is happening. We want to go and arrange meetings with every African state that you can, specifically Togo. We did that. We called embassies and missions, and we said, hey, it's important. We need to meet with you. ASAP. We had these meetings, and we had a meeting with Togo in particular, and we were able to have very advanced, sophisticated, respectfully, much more advanced than most of the states at the UN would have given, conversations about the threat of Israel and about the economic failure and the environmental failure of Israel, because this is what they were touting. And you know what? The summit didn't happen, right? So there are cracks looking at every institution in its parts and seeing where we can access. And I, by no means, say that the UN is where we do this. I'm talking about schools. You know, the garbage that I was taught about Palestinians, about myself in elementary school, the garbage I was taught about myself in high school and university, I mean, it's disgusting. Talk about trauma, right? This needs to be addressed. Nadler, get a proper petition that doesn't just talk about ending the occupation and settlements. No, let's talk about right to return. Those are the petitions. Lobby, stand outside of their door. Narrative is what becomes policy. You take this narrative, you make it into demands. These eventually become policy. Given the polarization in the world, but especially in the United States, right? The world is polarizing, the country is polarizing, the youth are polarizing. There's a lot of empty space that needs to be filled. Media, why don't we have one-on-one private meetings and hold every media outlet accountable, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post? These are all spaces that we have that we can access. Let's build a school, as one of Nirdine's colleagues said, and I learned recently, you know, we have the school to prison pipeline. Let's build a school to movement pipeline. Let's access these kids. So there's a lot to do. I want to talk about this issue of trauma teach, and you and I disagree about this, because in part there's a pathologizing of the Palestinian demand for return and liberation. And I know that it's not your intent to do that, but when you bring it up in these terms and these frameworks, it pathologizes, you know, this very basic issue, which is resolved just by let us go home. For God's sakes, I want to be able to go back to my country without worrying about which agency is going to, you know, kidnap me when I try to get in. And that's our reality for most of us, right? I just want to go home. That would resolve so much of my trauma. Number one. Number two, framing it in the question of siblings. I'm sorry, Zionists from Europe are not my siblings. I mean, that is an obfuscation of the reality. No Zionist has gone to Palestine with a deed or with a trace of their ancestors to living in my home in Palestine. That has not happened, I assure you. But Palestinians can trace that to at least being habitual residents up until 1947 preceding 1947 or thereafter. So this framework, though I'm sure you mean well, is a very dangerous framework that perpetuates Zionist narrative and Hezbollah. So we have to step away from that, and that's it.
I'm just going to touch quickly on the question about how we equate the U.S. to Israel. So one term that we actually like to say that Israel and U.S. have is settler colonial solidarity. Of course, the U.S. provides Israel with $38 billion in military aid over the course of 10 years. That's over $3.8 billion of military aid per year, while Flint, Michigan still has poisonous water. You know, Israel cannot exist without the support of the United States, which shows up for it not only financially, but as Lamis mentioned earlier, in international arenas, you know, making the UN impotent when it comes to Palestine through their veto power. So I think, you know, the same fight against Israel is also a similar fight that we have to have against the U.S., against imperialism, and against, you know, Israel's, in some ways, like, obviously when it comes to Palestinians, it's much, you know, worse, but, you know, on an outside, facing outwardly and facing the rest of the international world, Israel's kind of, it's a mini U.S. It's doing the same exact thing, or an outpost of U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. So continuously, you know, drawing these comparisons between them. And, you know, I was telling them earlier, I just came from the Celebrate Israel Day Parade. Of course, all the flags that they have together are Israel and American flags. When JDL comes counter-protest us, they hold Israeli and American flags. They're making these connections for us, actually, Zionists themselves. You know, all we have to do is continue to exploit these connections and show that this is not a good thing, but rather a danger and a safety to the people of the world, not just Palestinians, but as you said, whether it be Native Americans here, the dozens of oppressed nations the hundreds of oppressed nations actually living in the U.S. and the people of the world outside that continue to be pummeled militarily by the U.S., by Israel, and by their shared connection and support, not only through the military, but also through their police forces, which they train. There's a lot of conversations about this. There's a lot of information about the exchange of technology, the exchange of weaponry, and basically the perpetuating imperialism between these two countries that I think we should continue to elevate to hold them both accountable for this.
Okay.
Yeah, Nikki Haley.
Okay. I think we have to make partnerships, and we have with all movements, especially in the U.S. with the native tribes of the Americas, and
That's
That's
supporting.
approval, that's agreement.
So we don't clap and drown you out, we just.
those millennials,
Generational gap.
and with the African American movements. That is crucial. But when we talk about guilt, mark it. It's not Israel guilty or controlling the U.S. It's the U.S. guilty and controlling Israel. Don't forget that the U.S. has huge interest in the area. Don't forget that Israel demolished Iraq, and the Iraqis are not working as hard as we Palestinians are to do politics and to be activists. And our activism, in spite of huge attack on us, is really something unusual. I really commend each and every Palestinian who opens their mouth and speaks. Second of all, don't take the media as the voice of America. The media is just criminal, and it is totally in collusion with the governments, including our so-called Palestinian Authority government, who takes orders from Israel and takes orders from America. So for me, real leadership will come from the working class, from the communists, from the Marxists, and I'm looking at China right now. In the past few months,
They were also at the
70 communist parties were invited to talk with each other, exchange information, and 2 of those parties were from Palestine. So there is our hope, and so study those issues, look at them. What Lamis is describing is extremely valuable, because every stone you throw at the enemy counts. Every person we gain as a partner in our effort to demolish imperialism counts. So join us and pick up some intellectual stones.
Real stones.
But remember, I saw a film yesterday on Gaza which woke me up because I had some very negative feelings about aspects of it. Remember that Palestinian leadership is uppermost in efforts. Yes, join us, but listen to what we're saying. If we have our organizations, we lead them, and that is crucial.
Look at the world, full of tragedy. Wherever you turn your head, you see people being oppressed, people being kicked out of their homes, people being, entire communities becoming test fields for the armed industries and for the industrial military complexes here and everywhere, Myanmar, for example, and so on. So I think we are at a moment right now where the world needs progressive resistance, and where the world is actually witnessing attempts on the part of many progressives to push against this reality that is very threatening to us. And Trump is nothing but a part of this current global context that we live in. That said, it's important for progressives in the U.S. who want to take part in resisting Trump and resisting this direction towards right-wing fascism and so on, is to remember that the many times that they do not want to incorporate Palestine, they should remember the many times they were liberal on everything but on Palestine, they were progressive on everything but Palestine, and they need to understand how Israel set these dangerous precedents that are being now that are taking place on larger scales globally. So this is important, and it's an important thing to remember in the Trump era, and also, hopefully, if we overcome this gloomy period here and in the, on a global scale and global stage in general, hopefully